Welcome to the Addiction Connection podcast, connecting the hope of the gospel with the heart of addiction. I'm your host, Mark Shaw, and I'm joined for part 2 with Mr. Mike Petri. Drum roll.
The one and only.
Now, hopefully you listened to part 1 yesterday. If you didn't, it's okay. We're going to go in a little different direction than we did yesterday. Yesterday we talked, the last podcast was recovery and transformation, because it's National Transformation Month. That's September. Some people call it National Recovery Month, but they would be mistaken. It's National Transformation Month for Christians. If you're an unbeliever, call it National Recovery Month, all you want. But for Christians, it's Transformation Month. So that's what we talked about on the previous podcast. On this podcast, I want to go in a little different direction and just focus a little bit on the relationship between law enforcement and addiction issues, because Mike is a local law enforcement agent. So he is involved in that world on a day-to-day basis. He sees a lot and can share some insights and some help for us who maybe aren't as connected to that. But I want to read first Romans 13, starting in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And then it goes on about taxes. So we're going to skip that part. Yeah, we'll just skip that. But Mike, in thinking about authority, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I've seen some cases in the last 10 years and even recently of some people trying to help who just are unwilling to submit to spiritual authority in the church, a pastor, an elder, a deacon, somebody who has some spiritual authority over this drug-addicted person, and they really don't want to come under that because they really want to continue doing what they want to do. And I think about what you do in law enforcement. It's similar to that. You have to deal with people who will not submit to you in that moment. And just watching you work and hearing the stories and different things, and even one time being involved with you on a crazy escapade, if you can talk about that. I don't know if you can, but watching you work, you are really good at what you do. And I'm so thankful that you serve in this way, in a very unthankful position, an unpopular position today in our culture for the reason of we don't want to be submissive. And I think Romans 13 speaks to that. So I don't even know what I want to ask you right now. I'm just kind of overwhelmed. But I want to thank you, first of all, for your service and what you do. When you deal with somebody who is drug affected, it's really hard. They're not going to really be coherent and listening to you. Right. You want them to be sober, and we've talked about those sobering centers that are around the U.S. For law enforcement to take people to those. We don't have one in our local area, but they're growing. But that would be a really nice thing for you to have, is to take somebody there, right?
Yes, if that was properly implemented in our area, I think it could be very good.
Yeah,
it takes some stress off the officers.
Yeah,
be another option for people who maybe don't quite need to be incarcerated at this point.
Yeah, right.
Maybe a little detour for them, open their eyes.
Yeah. I wrote a blog about it. It's on the website, and I might have even done a podcast. I think I did a long time ago, which was probably 2 weeks ago, for me with my memory. But sobering centers, yeah, because you guys really don't want to arrest people who are on drugs and out of their mind and all that, but you've got to figure out a way to get them help or get them under control. So
Right.
let's speak to the dilemma that an officer has when they come up on a situation there, because it's either jail or do I let this person go? And I mean, that's a really puts you in a tough spot, I can imagine.
It does. What you find with veteran officers is you have a frustration level. I don't want to talk you through getting any help or doing anything else. I'm just going to put you in handcuffs and end the problem for the night.
Yeah.
And then they go to jail for 8 hours and they're back at it. A new officer wants to change the world and doesn't realize that you don't change the world by policing. You change the world by having a relationship with somebody one at a time.
Amen.
But the frustration is all the things that come along with addiction, the choices that people are making, the court systems, the social programs, all the things that don't address the heart issue. It's just a Band-Aid, and unfortunately, a lot of times it just tends to enable. Then you have the crime that comes along with it, people feeding their addiction. They want what they want. They're going to find a way to get it. And so you have a whole lot of victims, petty crimes, and you're trying to fix this problem, and all you're doing is looking around and being frustrated day after day, dealing with the same people over and over. The last podcast, I mentioned that story, dealing with the lady who had overdosed several times. It's the same thing. I let myself get to that point. As long as people are going to do what they want, they're going to feel justified because they're trying to feed their own desires. I can't tell you how many times you deal with people on marijuana and they justify, well, it's just marijuana. Right. And marijuana is still illegal. So you are just breaking the law. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you are a representative of law enforcement. It only matters that they want what they want. In the passage you read, verse 4, it says, "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good." And that strikes me, for your good.
Yeah.
I'm not there to necessarily punish and hold somebody down and take their freedom and do all these things. I'm there to correct a bad behavior. If you look at the job description, it is to prevent and correct bad behavior. Mm-hmm. If I pull you over and you say, yeah, I did run that stop sign, I apologize, that was a poor decision on my part, I'm probably just going to give you a warning and say, all right, lesson learned. I appreciate your honesty. Be on your way.
Right.
Because the desire is to correct the behavior. You're not correcting behaviors when people are set in their way and they're not getting any help to change how they're viewing things. Mm-hmm. They instantaneously view the police as the enemy because they're trying to take their freedom to sin.
Yeah.
That's what it amounts to. So it's very frustrating to see how far reaching it is. And people think that police have all this power. Well, our power and authority is really constricted. I can take your freedom and make you go to court, or I cannot. That's what it amounts to. I can't make you live your life differently.
Right.
So that's how we keep on seeing the same people over and over.
Wow. That's so good. I can imagine. I mean, even as a biblical counselor, you get frustrated with seeing maybe some of the same situations or the same people again and again, continuing to do that. But then I think about God and his patience for me and my sin and my propensity to sin, the way that I sin. It's like we need grace and we need mercy, but we need the justice of God as well to help correct our behavior. And that there's a lot of similarities in what you do with biblical counseling, which makes you a good biblical counselor for Grace Fellowship Church. And I'm so thankful you're on that team, and Margie as well. Both of you guys are a blessing. What are some ways that we can pray for our local law enforcement agents? You guys need prayer as much or more than anybody. I mean, you're under attack nationally for just popular ideas that really aren't based in truth. And so we have an absence of the facts and truth, and people are believing things that aren't true and assailing, going against our local, law enforcement. And so how can we pray for you and for the other guys and ladies that serve so faithfully and kind of a thankless job and not a huge 6-figure, 7-figure job at all?
That'd be nice. Everybody who does this job, they understand that the majority of society appreciates what we do and they're thankful. They're just not the vocal majority, and that's fine. We go to work every day and we tell each other in roll call, be safe, watch each other's back. That's what we do. Goal number one is to get home safe. We all have lives to live. We all have responsibilities outside of work. And that goes for the people committing crimes too. They
Sure.
have lives outside of dealing with us.
Right.
But the whole idea is that everybody goes home safe, regardless of who it is. So praying for our safety would be step one. Step two is for anybody who's in law enforcement for any length of time, you got to pray that God would protect us from becoming jaded, from becoming bitter, becoming angry. That last story I told about the lady who had overdosed multiple times. I was jaded, I was angry, I was frustrated, and that came out. You don't want it to come out. We have a tendency not to look at these things as a growing experience for each one of us, and we need to be looking at it that way. But I can't expect my fellow officers who are not Christians, I can't expect them to have that outlook. Even though I expect that outlook for myself, I fail often.
Sure.
So we're human beings. We need God's grace. Bottom line, we need to have kid gloves when it's appropriate to have kid gloves, and we need to be fearless when it's time to be fearless. We can't be thinking about all the things going on social media and on the news and all the lies people are propagating against us, because that will affect your decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And when your decision making is affected on the job in the heat of the moment, bad decisions are going to get made, and that's going to make things 10 times worse. And you see that in I've seen it since, really Ferguson, in my mind, is where it all started. I'm sure guys who've been around longer have seen it other times as well.
Sure.
But you see guys second guessing their training, second guessing their instincts, and that bad things happen, real bad things happen. So I would also encourage people who are interested in what we do, are willing to hear our side of why we do things the way we do things, do a ride along and ask questions. I love it when people ride along and ask me, hey, why'd you just roll through that stop sign? I get a ticket for that. And I could say, oh, well, let me explain to you why I did that. Number one, I shouldn't have. But number two, I'm looking at the message from my fellow officer about a case that he's watching a house right now or doing whatever, or I'm trying to get to this other officer who's on something over here. There's always a reason. Sometimes you roll a stop sign because you just made a bad choice. Sometimes you roll a stop sign because there's nobody around. It's 3:00 in the morning. There's not a soul anywhere, and that officer needs somebody to back him up right now, and I need to get there. By policy, stop unless you're running lights and siren. Yes, I should do that. So having a civilian in your car with you, it's awesome because you can be held accountable because you're getting a civilian view. We all get blinders on. You do what you do, and you forget about everything else. It's good to have that break in monotony from time to time. So being aware of other perspectives, as officers, we need to be aware of how society is viewing us, not just in the media, but your own local, be connected with the community. I guess that's the biggest thing. We need to be connected with the community. So be praying for that. Be praying for relationships with the community. It's really easy for cops to be closed off. If you're not in that circle, we don't want anything to do with you. And I can honestly say that I've tried hard for my entire career to make sure I had friends outside of the police circle for that reason. I don't want to be swallowed up by my job. Being an officer is not who I am. It is what I do. And yeah, it shapes who I am in many ways, but it's not who I am. So be praying in those ways that God would use us as instruments for change in those settings.
You sparked a thought and maybe a question.
Uh-oh.
Well, like what we do as human beings, we're not human doings, we're human beings. So, but what we do is important, and you do kind of put on a hat when you're doing your thing. You have to remember your role and how you should act and who you're representing and that kind of thing. And I think about that as a Christian, that we're human beings and that our identity is not tied to what we do. It's just a role that we play. And it's an important role, whether it's a pastor, law enforcement, whatever the role is that you're doing. A biblical counselor is a role. We are to play that role. And I say play, I don't mean it like act, but we're fulfilling that role. Maybe that's a better way to do that. And there is authority in certain roles that is God given, like we see in Romans 13. And really, Romans 13 is talking to individual persons. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And I think that could even apply in the church world, that people submit to their pastor, their biblical counselor, their spiritual authorities. You are a chaplain in your role as well. Tell us a little bit about that. I know you've got weddings that you're doing coming up, and all that has to do with relationships as well. So tell me a little bit about the joys of serving as a chaplain.
Being a chaplain, we talked to a captain a few years ago saying, I think it would be wise to have a chaplain who is actually an officer, because just like I said before, officers are closed off. If you're not in the circle, we're not talking to you.
Right.
And an officer wants to talk to another officer, because another officer is going to understand what you went through. They're going to understand the anger. They're going to understand why you're frustrated. And so being a chaplain, well, now you've got a title that guys say, you know what? He probably a good person to talk to. I get phone calls off duty, which I love. I absolutely love it. It makes me feel, when you view your job as a ministry, that's a good thing. And everybody in police work burns out at some point. Becoming chaplain was a new lease on life for my career, because there's you feel useful. You feel like you're filling a role that needs to be filled. Mm-hmm. Most chaplains and most agencies are, they're in the community and they're there for somebody who's just lost a loved one or whatever. They come and they'll deal with that civilian. But where's the chaplain for the police officer? They go to EAP at the local hospital, whatever, which better than nothing.
Right.
But to have somebody who does the job that you work side by side, again, building relationships with people, it's a wonderful thing. I've had guys come to work on their off time to ride in a car with me just to talk.
Wow.
And that's a fantastic thing, to know that you have an outlet, you have somebody that you can talk to. There's not going to be any judgment.
Yeah.
And just talk about life. And sometimes that's all somebody needs. They need to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get it out and not feel judged and have an ear, and maybe you get some good advice at the same time, well, that's a win-win.
Yeah.
So I love being a chaplain. It's been good.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a couple of weddings.
I am. Got some weddings coming up. They are a little bit stressful, because you want to be perfect.
Yeah.
I'm far from perfect, but it's also, I love weddings, and it's fun to watch friends get married and to be able to be a part of it. That's pretty neat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a picture of Christ and his church. What I love about this Romans 13 passage is it's not saying these authorities are perfect. They're humans, but God has put them in this place. And even wicked authorities, people that are in high positions of office and other places that do things, self-serving things and aren't thinking about serving the people. I mean, I think in our government, boy, if people would go into government rather than seeking to gain, would go in to serve and give and help, it would transform the way our culture operates. But it seems like the majority of them are in it for personal gain for whatever reason. Maybe it's power, maybe it's, whatever, but finances, money. You can follow the trail. Money is usually at the end of it.
If you have, I would say this too, going back to praying for the police, I would encourage everybody that if you have an interaction with an officer and you think he was a jerk or came on heavy-handed or too strong or whatever, like you said, they're people too. They might be having a bad day. Mm-hmm. We're always thinking about our safety, and sometimes if we don't know you, you're a threat until we figure out that you're not a threat.
Right.
Don't take it personal, but respond with grace. Respond with a little bit of love, and watch how that can diffuse that situation. You know, our society isn't doing that anymore. If I disagree with you, you have no value to me.
Yeah.
That's what our society is saying, and we are clashing with society, with civilians as police officers on their worst day. And so when that is the overriding attitude and you couple that with somebody's worst day, it has a tendency to be volatile.
Yeah.
They're offended, they're mad at you, and it's easy to reciprocate.
Yeah.
We need to show grace and love instead.
Well, we'll end with this. Romans 13:5. We read 1-5 earlier, but verse 5 ends with this. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And I think God uses our wrongs in a redemptive way. He uses that. And like you said, one of the roles is to correct bad behavior. We know that the Holy Spirit corrects the heart, changes those heart desires, and that sake of conscience. That's where it happens, where people recognize, I did something wrong, sinful against God. And that's where I love the gospel to be the message. Rather than you've got a disease and addiction and all this, we want to talk about, what? It's sin. It's something you've desired wrongly from your heart that needs to change at that conscience heart level, and that we can help you with that. And if you're willing to work with us, we're willing to work with you. And I love seeing transformation happen at the heart level for the addicted, and I appreciate what you do. You have a tough job, and what you do. Working with the addicted, I thought was hard until I talked to you. And then I realized it's second hardest. There are lots of hard things that God calls us to do, but I'm thankful for you, thankful for your ministry, both vocationally and at our church. You're doing ministry all the time. You're a blessing. So we will pray for you and your family.
Thank you.
I ask our listeners to do that right now for the Petri family. And thank you, Mike, for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast. Tune in next time for the Addiction Connection podcast, where we share the hope of the gospel for the heart of the addicted.